It's election day at last as polls open across the United States. I'm Marcus Mabry, and this is the New York Times. We'll check in with our team in Ohio and look at potential legal challenges from the election shortly. But first, I spoke to political editor Dick Stevenson just a few minutes ago about what to expect as Election Day unfolds. Dick, this is it. You've been leading for more than a year a team of dozens of New York Times reporters, editors, web producers, graphic designers covering this campaign. Are you ready for this campaign to be over?
You know, as an American citizen, I'm ready for it to be over. As somebody who's watched, like everybody else, a gazillion ads and heard all the arguments a million times, yeah, it's time for us to vote. You know, as a journalist, it's a little more bittersweet. You know, there's no story that is as substantively important, as full of drama and excitement, and, you know, this time around, uncertainty as a presidential campaign. So, you know, as a story, we'd love it to go on.
Speaking of uncertainty, what are our reporters hearing from the campaigns as far as what their internal models tell them about turnout? Where will the Obama campaign be looking as the day goes on, and where will the Romney campaign be watching?
There are really two ways to answer that question. One is demographics and one is geographical. To take the first one, what Romney needs to do if he's going to win is make the electorate look much more like the 2004 electorate that gave George W. Bush a second term. If you break down Obama's numbers in 2008, he won 43% of the white vote. In 2004, Bush managed to hold John Kerry to 41%. So Romney needs to drive up his percentage of the white vote. It's the same with women, Hispanics, and young voters in particular. In all of those cases, Romney needs to make those numbers look more like 2004 than 2008. Mm-hmm. Now, geographically, there are a couple of key places that everybody's going to be looking at tonight. Virginia closes at 7 o'clock. If you look at the exurbs of Washington, D.C. in northern Virginia, like Loudoun County, this is a place that Obama won by something like 51-48. Bush in 2004 won that county 58-41. Huge swing to Obama. Romney needs to bring those voters in those exurbs of Northern Virginia home if he's going to win Virginia. Similarly, Hamilton County in Ohio, outside of Cincinnati. Obama won in 2008. First time a Democratic candidate had won that county since 1964. Again, Romney has got to bring Republican-leaning, traditionally Republican voters home in a region like that if he's going to carry Ohio. And through those two places, I think you'd get a sense of where swing voters and swing counties are going to be going.
Phalanxes of lawyers have fanned out to polling stations, especially in those swing states and swing counties. Do you anticipate voting challenges today?
Well, we're going to be on the lookout for them everywhere. You know, I think there are a number of different things to be watching for here. One is what the Democrats would call voter suppression, what the Republicans are going to be casting as voter fraud, the question of the integrity of the voting process. There are new voter ID laws that are in effect in a lot of states, including some of the swing states. There's likely to be a lot going on around those as people confront those for the first time. You know, there are also, though, the questions later in the night about recounts, challenges to provisional ballots, all kinds of legal things that could play out for hours, days, theoretically even weeks, if things got really, really tight in a place like Ohio.
So especially those provisional ballots I've heard about, especially in Florida and in Ohio?
Yeah, you know, in Ohio in particular, there is some uncertainty right now about what the rules are going to be. That may not be fully litigated until tomorrow. If the margin is close enough and the number of provisional ballots could actually tilt the outcome in Ohio, you're going to be learning, you know, as much about provisional ballots in 2012 as you did about Chad's in 2000.
And we're talking about 200,000 provisional ballots cast in Ohio.
Possibly, you know, in a really tight race, enough to make the difference.
All right, so that brings me to my final question. Will we have a winner tonight?
Well, you know, we'll be ready either way, and, you know, we'll be here until we get some kind of outcome. It's really hard to know. You know, sometimes in elections, everything breaks in one direction. But, you know, whenever things are close, the counting tends to be a little bit slower than you think it's going to be. So it could well be a long night, but we'll be ready either way.
All right, we'll be watching with you. Thanks so much.
Great to be here.
Of all the swing states in this election, Ohio could be the most important. It is certainly getting plenty of attention from both campaigns. Ohio may also be the epicenter for legal challenges to this election. John Broder and Cassie Bracken are on the ground in Columbus, and they filed this report.
I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, in front of the state capitol, and Election Day is finally here. And it can't come a moment too soon for the campaign-weary residents of this state. They've been subjected to tens of thousands of television ads, millions of telephone calls, thousands of visits to their doorstep. All eyes have been on Ohio for much of this campaign, in part because it has a reputation of being the state that picks presidents. No Republican has ever won the White House without winning Ohio, and most of the paths that even Barack Obama has to winning re-election go through Ohio. For the first time in state history, early voting was allowed in the last weekend and the last day right up until Election Day. And there were long lines of people trying to cast their ballot, in fact, rushing to get into line before they finally cut it off at 2 p.m.
I took off sprinting because they were shouting 30 seconds, and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to make it, and then I don't think I made it.
You going to vote tomorrow?
Yes, I have to work. That's why I was trying to come down today.
Reading the political geography of Ohio has become quite a science for political pollsters and pundits, and there are a few areas that they'll be watching closely. Of course, what's important for Barack Obama is that he run up big margins in the state's urban areas, Toledo, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus. But there are a number of swing areas in the central part of the state and up near Akron and Canton, where people will be watching the vote precinct by precinct to see who's piling up a small enough margin to possibly make a difference. Ohio has been the scene of many pitched legal battles over who gets to vote and how and when. Thousands of people have voted early in this state. In fact, over 1 million of them have. But there's still some question of whether all of those ballots will count. The state uses something called provisional voting, and in fact in Ohio more provisional ballots are cast than in much bigger states like New York and California. And those 200,000 ballots probably won't be counted until well after Election Day. Along with the thousands of campaign workers that poured into Ohio to campaign either for Obama or Romney, hundreds and hundreds of lawyers are on scene here. One, to watch the counting to see that the election is carried out fairly, and two, to be in place in case there's a contest or a recount.
Ohio is just one place where the lawyers are on standby. For more on potential legal issues nationally, we turn to Ethan Bronner, who joins me now in our newsroom. Ethan, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here, Marcus.
Tell me, where else will we be watching today to see if there are potential problems both at the polling stations and then later on as far as challenges to the votes?
Of course, the main issues are the so-called swing states. So Ohio is the central swing state, but there is Virginia, there's Florida, there's Wisconsin, there's Nevada, there's New Hampshire. So all of these states where it's going to be very close, therefore the issue of have people been able to get to the ballots and have their ballots been properly counted, those are the issues that lawyers are on standby worried about. So in Wisconsin, for example, the Obama campaign has already complained that the Romney campaign was misinforming its poll workers by telling them certain things, restrictive notions about access to polling stations, also urging their poll workers to sign in as concerned citizens as opposed to party activists. And the argument was that this could be both it's a misrepresentation and it could be an illegal act to do that. So those are the sorts of things that are happening. If there are long lines in Florida, okay, Florida, which was the center of the problem in 2000, there are long lines already in Florida. What's a long line? Well, that has to be litigated too. Is 80 minutes a long line or is 5 hours long? But if it is 5 hours and people decide not to vote because it's such a long line, then the Obama campaign is very likely to go to court and say, you shut down early voting, and that's why there are such long lines, and therefore we object, and therefore...
Florida had much shorter early voting period this time than they did 4 years ago.
It did. I mean, they extended the hours per day, but they had many fewer days. So there was a lot of argument in all these places about that, particularly in black areas in Florida, where black churches tend to organize voters in a so-called souls to the polls on Sundays before. That got knocked out. So those are issues that lawyers are very focused on.
Now, the Republicans, as Dick was saying earlier, the Republicans always talk about this notion of voter fraud. Democrats talk about this notion of voter suppression.
Right.
Is there evidence that there's actually a foundational basis in either of these concerns?
It's a difficult question. We know that there has been, the issue is the scale of both. Okay, we know that there has been voter registration fraud because officials have found that groups that pay people to register voters have sometimes paid them bonuses or paid them per registered voter, and then they find that they have fake people registered in order to make money. And that has been, we know that's happened. At the same time, we know that if you reduce early voting hours, if you make it harder to go to the polls, whether you call that suppression or not is, of course, a political question. But we know that it makes it harder for people to vote. And vulnerable populations, inner city populations, people who are, not well established, who don't have cars, it's harder for them with getting voter IDs and getting to the polls, that sort of thing. So in that sense, there is a struggle on both sides to get their guys out to the polls.
One state we haven't talked about yet is Pennsylvania, and some people might be surprised given what the polls, for the most part, show, actually all the polls show, about Obama being ahead so much in Pennsylvania. The Romney campaign has certainly been present there. Governor Romney there again today, in his final day of campaign, the final day of this election.
It's true.
Democrats talk about voter intimidation in Pennsylvania. Is that?
Yes, people do. So the issue there are several issues in Pennsylvania. One, of course, is, as you say, that it has typically gone Democratic, but it does have a Republican governor and a Republican-controlled legislature, and it's an area where Romney sees this possibility of winning this time. So it also passed a voter ID law, and there was an enormous amount of litigation around this, so that at the moment it's in this weird state, which is the law is valid but not applicable to today, Election Day. So poll workers are supposed to ask voters, do you have an official photo ID? And if the voter doesn't have one, he or she can still vote. So that's a pretty strange cut the baby in half situation. There's that. Then we have a group of civil rights groups who have written to officials in Pennsylvania complaining about white men in suits hanging around black polling areas. And in their mind, this is an act of potential intimidation. Just to show that the issue of race in this country, the issue of the history of voter intimidation of minorities is still very sensitive in certain areas.
Where will you be watching to see if there's actually an issue developing as the night goes on?
Those are the places I'm watching. Ohio in particular, right, where we just heard from John on the ground, and in Pennsylvania, in Florida, and in Wisconsin, because in Wisconsin there's not just that issue that I just mentioned, there's also the issue that the Romney campaign has asked for an extension on the counting of absentee ballots, which are largely from the military there, because they didn't go out on time in a few cases. So they want an extension in all these cases. So each side has a legitimate basis for argument, but of course it tends to stir it up when its own voters are most concerned.
We talk about this possibility that we may not even know who the winner of this election is tonight because of all these issues.
That's
and
right.
we talk again about those 200,000 provisional ballots in Ohio and when they're counted and by whom.
That's right.
What role could 200,000 provisional ballots in Ohio play?
Big. I mean, President Obama won Ohio in 2008 by 265,000 votes about, and there are 200,000 provisional ballots in that year, and there are expected to be the same number this year. There is a case being argued tomorrow in court in Ohio, which says that that the way these votes are counted is inappropriate. You require an exact match on registration, your name and the name that you've given, and of course there could be an initial or a married name, all that sort of thing. And Democrats in Ohio have found several thousand voters who were inappropriately told that they were not registered. So these are the kinds of battles going on. And when the gap is so narrow, that's when lawyers will be brought in to try to squeeze out the final votes. And of course the Republicans are accusing the Democrats of seeking litigation. The Democrats reject that.
Could be a tough, long day. Ethan, thanks so much for joining us.
More than a day. It could be a tough, long month.
Excellent. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Finally, the financial crisis in 2008 set the tone for that election. 4 years later, very little of the reform intended to deal with that crisis has actually been enacted. We asked experts what they thought would happen to reform efforts such as the Dodd-Frank law after Election Day.
So what did we do? We stepped in and had the toughest reforms on Wall Street since the 1930s.
Every free economy has good regulation. At the same time, regulation can become excessive.
Is it excessive now,
Well,
do you think?
in some places, yes.
Like
In other
where?
places,
Give me
no.
an- give me
It can
an-
become out of date.
Though President Obama and Governor Romney have each spent time on the campaign trail talking about financial reform, some experts question whether either candidate has a real solution.
It would appear, just from looking at it dispassionately, that Romney would be better for the industry.
I am dissatisfied with both candidates. I think that's fair.
But from our standpoint, this is what we do for a living. I can't really make that comment because I don't really understand exactly what he would be doing different than the Obama administration.
Repeal Dodd-Frank?
Well, I would repeal that and replace it. We're not going to get rid of all regulation. You have to have regulation.
Okay. All right.
And there's some parts of Dodd-Frank that make all the sense in the world.
There is clear dissatisfaction with Dodd-Frank.
So the Obama administration was taking pretty strong steps in terms of the Dodd-Frank Act, at least in theory. The problem is that by the time the Dodd-Frank Act played itself out, and certainly by the time the pieces of legislation that make up the Dodd-Frank Act turn into regulation, they really become riddled with loopholes.
Unfortunately, the financial regulations under Dodd-Frank, many of the rules are proving to be almost unworkable. So it's not clear when we think about who's going to be better for financial markets and the overall stability of the economy, financial sector, whether it's going to be Obama or Romney.
While experts differ over their support for Dodd-Frank, there is concern about what would happen without it.
The industry has been supportive of reform really since '08 and worked very hard on many aspects of Dodd-Frank.
Governor Romney has not been very specific on what he would do about financial reform. He says that he would repeal and replace Dodd-Frank. But one practical problem with that is that so many of the rulemaking processes have at least started.
The question remains as to which candidate can prevent another crisis and improve the economy.
President Obama would definitely be a much better candidate for the purpose of financial reform than Mitt Romney. In fact, Mitt Romney would be pretty catastrophic.
On the other side, if we see that the introduction of these rules under Obama is creating enormous amount of uncertainty, huge costs of compliance, and it's going to make it even more difficult for the economy to gain traction and to move forward.
We don't really see that big a change, whether it's going to be a second Obama turn or a new Romney. I think the way in which government works, especially when you're doing global regulatory initiatives, is it's relatively neutral to who's actually in the seat of president.
There you have it. Hardly a consensus. That's all for now, but we will return at 1 p.m. for another live update as Election Day unfolds. As always, you can follow the action all day long with us online. I'm Marcus Mabry. Thanks for watching the New York Times.